Hello and welcome to the World Built Environment Forum webinar series. First of all, our thanks to Colliers International as World Built Environment Forum Premier Partner, and to our executive partners, Glodon and Shanghai Oriental Investment Supervision Company. My name is John Krause, and our focus in this session is how to manage risks inherent in water supply. Three industry experts are joining us today. Our first panelist is Jessica Lamond. She is a professor in real estate and climate risk at the University of the West of England and co-author of the World Bank Handbook on Urban Flood Management. She's joining us today from Shrewsbury in the United Kingdom. Welcome, Jessica. Also with us is Mandakini Suri, an international development practitioner with over 15 years of program design, development, aid and grant management experience in South Asia. She's joining us online today from New Delhi, and welcome to you, Mandakini.
Thanks, John.
And speaking today from Hong Kong is Alfred Lee, past President Hong Kong of the Chartered Institution of Water and Environmental Management. Alfred is a chartered chemist, a chartered scientist, and a chartered water and environmental manager. Alfred, welcome to you.
Thank you, John. Greetings from Hong Kong.
Hi. Now, if you're a regular attendee of the World Built Environment Forum webinars, then welcome back. If you're new to us, then we very much hope you'll enjoy the webinar and find it useful and interesting. For everybody listening, we always welcome your active involvement, so do please submit questions to the panelists. You can do this at any time using the question box on your screen, and I will pick them up and weave them into the conversation as we go along. So, for our opening question, I'm going to ask Jessica to get us started. Now, we all know that urbanization means rising water demand in cities, and it raises questions about buildings on floodplains. Jessica, can you give us an overview of how urbanization is presenting new challenges to water management?
Okay, thank you, John. Yes, so I think this is about challenges to water management, but I think it's useful to think a little bit about the context of urban spaces and water, and to recognize that actually, as humans, we have a massive and deep connection to water in our urban environment. So we're seeing water management here in this seminar as a bit of a problem, as an issue, but we also recognize that it's integral to the way that we live. The latest situation, which I'm not going to talk about, but the fundamental advice to us all is to wash our hands with soap and water. Water is vital for everything that we do, and it's still vital, and we still congregate and aggregate around our coasts and around our waterways. And although it's technically and feasibly possible for us all to relocate away from those areas seen as risky in terms of flooding, this is not something that that happens very much and is not proposed very much, and people would resist it because the attractions of living near water are still very manifest, and it's still really important for us to live in areas where there is water. So in that context, we think about two challenges for water management, two big global challenges. One is climate change, and all of the latest estimates show that the water, two challenges with water. We live in a wet and warming world. We're going to have increased flooding from higher levels of rainfall or changing patterns of rainfall, but at the same time, we are going to have increased drought or water shortage through effects of warming and desertification in some areas of the world, conflicts over the rights to water. And those are things that are coming up in our future. But, and here is where real topic of this webinar comes to play. In the short term, urbanisation is arguably a bigger challenge for water management. So when we were looking at this in 2011 for the World Bank, all of the scientific evidence pointed to the fact that rapid urbanisation, particularly in developing regions of the world and rapidly urbanising regions of the world, was a bigger challenge for flooding and probably also for water management than climate change. So urbanisation and the built environment is compounding the problems of climate. And that's why it's so important that the RICS have taken a lead role in challenging us all to think about this as a topic. So how does it actually cause problems? As John says, initially, more people or a larger global population creates greater demand on water. But urbanisation, the force that is bringing probably by 2050, 70% of the world's 9 billion people into the urban space, creates concentrated and focused water demand. So water has to be piped and supplied to people in ways that it never has been before. It places more risks, puts more assets in floodplains, so people are developing floodplains. But another thing that urbanisation does is it decreases the permeability of the catchment in which that urban area sits. So, for example, if we think about a natural water cycle where maybe 35 to 40% of water would evaporate off the surface, 10% of the water would run along the surface, and 50% of the water would infiltrate deep, shallow or deep into the water table and into the aquifers. That would be a completely natural catchment. Once we get to a heavily and densely urbanised, 75% urbanised catchment, we're only seeing 15% of water infiltrating down into the aquifers, and we're seeing 55% of water running off the surface. So we've got two problems there. We've got water supply problems because we're not getting the infiltration, and we're getting flooding problems as surface water creates urban flooding on a massive scale.
Thank you, Jessica. Very, very clear there. So climate change, obviously the big challenge for us, but as you're saying there, urbanisation is only going to exacerbate that. A twin impact of urbanisation being the lack of water reaching the aquifers and excess runoff causing problems with managing that. Mandakini, you know, from South Asia where you are, how do those challenges resonate with you? Is that what you see in your region, or would you paint a different picture?
No, I think you know, I would kind of resonate and echo what Jessica has said. I mean, I think climate change and urbanization are two global processes that, you know, are occurring side by side but are deeply interconnected. So, I mean, particularly in South Asia, you see rapid urbanization, more and more people leaving rural areas and coming into urban spaces where, in most instances, the built environment has not been able to keep pace with the rate of this kind of rural to urban migration. Basic water facilities. So that's one thing, the pace of urbanization. The second thing is the population itself is putting stress on which is fueling use and extraction, not only for domestic purposes, but also for industry, for agriculture, for energy production. And then the factor which is of pollution. So in South Asia, for example, in many parts of northern India, the parts as well, you have a lot of groundwater contamination because of effluent and from industries and the treatment and sewage, for example. You also have the problem of aging infrastructure and water supply systems, for example, pipe infrastructure.
Mandakini, I think we're having a little trouble hearing you. Could you maybe come a bit closer to your microphone?
Can you hear me now?
Still a bit distant.
Can you hear me now?
That's clearer.
Yeah, so sorry, I'm not sure where I left off, but just to say that kind of linked to the issue of wastewater and sewage treatment is the issue of, you know, aging infrastructure and water supply systems. So having piped infrastructure which is kind of aging and not being able to, you know, a lot of losses to the system. And then I think the biggest problem that we have in South Asia, and I think this cuts across most of, whether it's at a national or local or even at a federal level, is this issue of mismanagement and poor governance. So very often, we see a lot of articles which say, South Asia is running out of water. Yes, because of climate change, there's increased variability, there's variations in temperature and precipitation, but a lot of it is also to do with the way in which water is managed and the kind of incentive systems and structures that have been in place for decades, which have actually fostered a system of governance which has incentivized wasteful practices. So I think that's a real challenge. And I think the other issue which we have in South Asia particularly is linking back to this issue of urban sprawl and concentration of populations in very small spaces, is this idea of social exclusion, inequity of access in terms of drinking water, sanitation, particularly for poor and vulnerable groups, and in particular for women. And as Jessica mentioned, that we're dealing with right now, you can imagine in large urban slums, forget access to soap, you don't even have access to water. So it has a huge public health implication as well. So yeah. So I think that the challenge for policymakers, just to round off, is to say, I think challenge is balancing the interest between demand and supply, managing the competing interests between different sectors, and from a human development perspective, also ensuring that the issues around lack of access to drinking water and sanitation are met.
Thank you. So I want to move it on now to the next question, which I think very much builds on the points that were being made there. So I want to look at the practices, the actual practices in managing water supply. And so therefore, I'm going to invite Alfred now to comment on what are responsible bodies, by which we mean city governments and water companies. What are they getting right in terms of managing water in the urban environment?
Thank you, John. Right. I mean, what do actually the responsible bodies, for the governing, getting it right is entirely different in some places. Now, I think, in many places, countries or regions, that water is being considered as a core business of the central, the governing bodies. But however, places like the Hong Kong now, or even Singapore, the control and the government, of the drinking water supplies actually is still under, the directly under the government issues. So it's more like, actually a direct, the control from the government is of the prime objectives. And however, I think you might aware that that places like many the Western the countries, like even in UK, the privatizations of water supplies over many decades ago that actually disconnect such responsibilities from the government supplies over to the water companies, and these companies or organizations are actually under the the supervisions of a central regulations that bodies like the drinking water inspectorate in UK, or perhaps the EPA, the EPA in the United States. So however, its most important thing is whether if proper that regulations that or registrations that are actually in place to supervise all these government's bodies. So here we are saying the situation like Hong Kong, it's actually as I mentioned before, the government is directly also directly running the water business. So the people are actually are civil servants, so they are subject to the direct that inquiries are actually the questions by the general public. So, or in a way, from by the legislation, the council people, that for the questions, and we are actually using the public money to run the business ourselves. And so, in this case, that we have certain the government bills or regulations, related to drinking water supply, the safety, and actually or others, regulations, to supervise, our operations on a day-to-day, the basis. And so I think if in the case for the urban environment, that for the urban developments, I think it would be more important, that a proper, the regulations, are actually in place, and we have to, instead of using the local situations to govern or to supervise, the running of the operations of water supplies, and you need to get in touch, with the others, that international or other nationals, the professional bodies, to provide, the advice on a more pragmatic level at all times. Same as in Hong Kong and Singapore, and as far as I know, in many in places where actually the government is actually responsible for the portable supplies. We have to get in touch, with our actually partners, on the national partners and international partners and experts around the world, to actually get in touch to keep us abreast, on the water issues, at all times. And also, we have to, that get into the public consultations at all times, that, before, a major or critical, regulations, and business on drinking water and wastewater treatment issues are being in place, beforehand. So I would say that even, with a different, responsible bodies, that who actually to getting right in the urban environment, we still have to have, our own, the regulation bodies to supervise us at all times, and it would be preferably, an independent bodies to supervise. So we have to distinguish, our day-to-day, our routine operations on, the water supplies, and independent, the regulatory bodies, like for, similarly to the DWI in the UK, the drinking water inspectorate, or in Hong Kong, we have the independent experts, that to supervise us, and which has actually enabled. But for situation in Hong Kong, we just only started with an independent, regulation bodies, that only just from the last 3 years.
Thank you, Alfred. So very good points there, pointing to the practices in Hong Kong and in Singapore, the use of professionals, and we'll come back later in this conversation about how professionals can play a role in all of this. So that's some of the things that perhaps we're doing relatively well. Turning now to Jessica. Now, Jessica, you have compared practices as the co-author of the RICS Research Trust report on flood risk mitigation and commercial property advice, which was an international comparison. And for anyone interested, you can find that piece of research on the RICS website. Jessica, can you highlight ways in which we seem to be getting it wrong?
Yeah, well, first of all, I would say that even that going further back, looking at flood management more broadly, I don't think there are any governments or cities or countries that are getting it 100% right. And so there's a lot of really good initiatives, and even if we're giving examples where something might not be right, that's not to say that there isn't equally good examples in the same city. And I think one of the things, certainly in flood management terms, that governments, and particularly city level governance probably, and we're going to talk about governance a bit later, get wrong is to think about this as a problem that can be solved. So looking at it as something that a pet project or a flagship project can solve, and then it will be, then we can look at something else and worry about something else. The water management is integral to city planning and land management, and it needs to be part and mainstreamed in everything that we do. And I think that's probably the biggest mistake that that is really made. And just to give you some examples of here's a flagship projects that may or may not work out. And we just have to look at Venice and the flood defences that have been designed there, that were designed to be delivered by 2011, and currently they are not. They're not there. They're not defending the city. So the flooding that happened this year would have been prevented, according to the mayor, by the defences. But engineers, on the other hand, argue that those are untried and untested methods of defending the city, and maybe that has been pursued against the other methods that could have been used, the soft methods and the more tried and tested methods. Governments do a lot to protect their citizens. If you look at the death rates over time from flooding, they have declined dramatically because governments rightly prioritise citizens' lives, they prioritise emergency planning, they prioritise forecasting and warning, and a lot of that is very good. Where there's less strength and purpose is in adapting the built environment. And so we're still focusing on large-scale channelization. We're still focusing on hard engineered flood defences as the way to adapt the built environment, and not focusing so much on the smaller scale stormwater management techniques that are needed in cities for intense rainfall flooding rather than river flooding. I think a mistake that cities make is in thinking that they can solve the whole of the flood risk management problem inside of their city, and not thinking in a catchment scale. So what cities can do and what individual water companies can do is to manage the water in their patch, and maybe more focus on that and less focus on the wider catchment, where they are at best negotiating and lobbying with wider governance systems.
Thank you. Some very interesting points there. I can't really striking that, you know, this is focused by some on, you know, the big, arguably sexy engineering solutions with, you know, grandiose schemes, when in fact softer techniques may have been more effective. And this idea that trying to solve things at the city level is really not the answer. You have to think at a much bigger scale, the catchment level. Mandakini, can I just ask you to comment? You've heard from Alfred and Jessica examples of good and bad, and what would be your views on that?
Well, I think, you know, the challenges that cities are facing are very real, and as you know, Jessica and Alfred have both highlighted, it's not as if governments at different levels are not aware of what the challenges are. But I think, particularly if I, you know, zoom in again to the region where I'm from, you know, cities are facing unprecedented challenges in terms of just the variability from, you know, extreme precipitation over a short period of time, followed a few months later by perhaps, you know, a drought. So, for example, you know, you will all have read the headlines last year where Chennai, the city of Chennai in the south of India, was said by many to have achieved or reached what was called 0 day with extreme water shortages, only a few months later to be inundated. So I guess the challenge then becomes for city managers is how do you manage for both scarcity and abundance? And I think part of it goes back to the way in which a lot of the cities were built or have planned and have grown in a kind of, you know, in a sprawling fashion, in an unplanned way, which has not taken into consideration either the water cycle, either a basin-wide approach, either a sense of what is the, you know, what is the kind of impact the built environment will have on these natural systems, and how then climate change is going to impact all of these things, and how they're going to work and interact together. So, for example, in Chennai, the airport is built on the side of a riverbank, which flooded tremendously, and all of the airplanes and the airport was shut. So, I mean, there are certain, you know, certain practices like that, which, you know, you would think those are common sense approaches, but what we're seeing is particularly in South Asia, because of, you know, climate change is leading to more intense rainfall over shorter concentrated periods of time, that cities are not being able to cope or necessarily bring into place the kind of changes they need in terms of policy, regulation, or in infrastructure to be able to cope with the pace of change. So I think it's a real challenge. And I think this is where a lot of, and I know we'll be talking about this subsequently, is looking at issues around how do you build climate resilient infrastructure, or how do you climate proof existing infrastructure?
Thank you, Mandakini, and that brings us very neatly on to the very next question, actually. So, and I'd like you to keep the microphone on this one, please. Looking at the future needs to safeguard farming and industry, specifically, how can we estimate the future needs of infrastructure resilience caused by, as you just mentioned there, the very variable availability of water, changes in rainfall patterns and their intensity, and you start to talk about Chennai there as an example. So what can we do to prepare our infrastructure for these new patterns?
Yeah, thanks, John. I think from an infrastructure perspective, it's necessary, as I said, to understand how the built environment as it exists and as you'd like it to be, and how that coexists with the natural environment. So each of these is part of a unique ecosystem, and it's important to understand how they work together, and also how climate change is going to be impacting them at different levels. So as I said, understanding the water cycle is really important. Understanding how climate change interacts with that, and how your infrastructure as it exists and as you plan to grow it is going to work with that. I think very often, particularly in a lot of cities, particularly in South Asia, there's a sense of, well, you can just build exponentially, and there's very little concern or understanding of, say, the role of whether it's in cities like Bangalore, Chennai, of lakes, of wetlands, or along the coast of mangroves, or in cities like Delhi, what the role that urban forests play, for example, in maintaining your soil, your soil structure, your water table, your air pollution, all of those factors. And I think we're moving much more towards an understanding of how these systems work together, particularly because the impacts of ignoring them are becoming more and more evident. So in terms of what we can do, I think climate resilient infrastructure is all about thinking about what is planned, designed, and built and operated in a way that anticipates or prepares for climate change. So one way in which you can do that is, for new infrastructure, is definitely thinking about locating it in areas that are less exposed to climate hazards. So for example, not building an airport along the side of a riverbank, or not building dams and structures on interstate basins where, for example, inundation could potentially have very negative downstream impacts. And also developing infrastructure in a way that looks at how it will impact the risks elsewhere. So for example, the potential contribution to flood risk by increasing paved surfaces, not having enough green spaces, not having enough open spaces which actually allow the water to soak in. And we see that in Mumbai, for example, which is again, a riverine island which is along the coast, and we know seasonally what happens with the intense monsoon flooding that happens there. There is just no drainage system for that water to go from the city and back into the ocean. It just stays there and percolates. And I think very often we tend to focus very much on the large metropolitan cities, because that's where the populations are, that's where the voting power is as well. But actually going forward, we need to look much more, and I speak particularly of this part of the world, is looking at emerging cities. So what we call the tier 2 and tier 3 cities, which don't necessarily have either the funds, the resources, or the capacity to be able to implement these things or think through these issues, because those are going to be the cities and the metropolitan centers of the future. And like, just to round off, I would say that all of these things basically again come down to a question of the governance and management of what is not only an increasingly scarce but also unpredictable and variable resource. So I think, just to cap that off, I would say that there are different strategies that can be approached. One is obviously in a built environment, looking at investing in rainwater harvesting and water conservation methods. For cities to augment their wastewater reuse and recycling, both at a kind of industry level, but also at a household, community, and a city level. Looking at lake and floodplain conservation, so improving your permeable surfaces, stormwater drainage infrastructure, restoring wetlands. And I think very often we also don't have the necessary data and information that we need to know how much surface and groundwater we actually have access to. And last but not least is also this issue around water pricing and efficiency. This is a very contentious issue in this part of the world, particularly in India, where for a long time water has been seen as a common pool resource which should be freely accessible, and there's a lot of incentive structures which have been built around that in agriculture and industry. But I think These are some different strategies that can be used to try and build certainly resilience both in different sectors, because I think the important thing for us to mention is also that water, it doesn't stand alone. It's part of a nexus. It feeds agriculture, it feeds industry, it feeds food security. It's critical to so many aspects of our lives. And so only tackling water at one level is really not going to solve the issues that we're dealing with currently.
Thank you, and that's a really interesting picture. This idea of not only does existing infrastructure need to be more resilient, we can move it to places where it may be less in need of strong resilience, but also we're going to need some new infrastructure, rainwater harvesting being one of those things. I just want to, we're going to move on to the next question in a moment, but just in response to that, I wonder, Jessica, did you have any thoughts to build on what Mandakini just had to say?
Okay, yeah, I think they're really good points, and covering a wide number of different infrastructures. It's very true that we need to think about the future. And one of the things that we can be sure of, and there's not much we can be sure of in the future, is that we don't know what it's going to look like. And so there's some ideas about how to deal with uncertainty in our future risks that need to be brought to bear here, because what we don't want to do is bring in maladaptation. So we're adapting to something that we expect to happen that doesn't happen, or we adapt to something and we build defences which will be overtopped, making things worse. So there's two concepts here which we talk about. One of which is failing gracefully. So making sure that whatever you do is robust to uncertainty, and that you're not going to make things worse in the future by making that investment where it is. And the other one is about being robust to be incremental. So if you're building a flood defence, for example, build it with very deep foundations so that in the future you can build higher, but don't build it as high as you think you might need it straight away. There's a good example of that in the Thames, in evaluating the need to replace the Thames barrier, whereby could have been done 10 years ago. The study was done, but actually what was put in place was a protocol for thinking about when is the best time to replace that infrastructure. And the other thing in terms of thinking about water management and drainage, when we're building pipes underground, that's fairly inflexible. We can't oversize the pipes. So we're looking for drainage solutions that can be more flexible and can be added to incrementally, and much of that is going to be on the surface or nearer to the surface than our traditional pipe solutions.
Thank you, and I think it's really interesting, this idea that uncertainty means you can't come up with a solution that's going to fix one scenario only, because if that scenario doesn't happen, you find your solution wasn't actually the right one, could even make things worse. So that's very interesting. And with that, I want to move on to the next question. Again, it's a question I think I'd like to ask Mandakini to lead on. It is, if we're looking at agriculture and industry. So just one example, I think last year Mississippi suffered widespread flooding which ruined the planting season there, and those floods were caused by a record level of rainfall and backed up waterways. So what steps can we take to help protect agriculture and industry against extreme water variability? Mandakini.
Yeah, thanks, John. I think that this is a really critical question. And again, speaking from the context, from a South Asian perspective, where, a large percentage of the region and the populations that live there are agrarian and depend on agriculture for, their livelihoods. And it's such an agrarian dominated society. I think the question really is how do you move and how do you transition whole sectors from a culture and psyche of water as an abundant and limitless resource to one that recognizes it as finite, and also recognizes the interconnections between water, its conservation, and how that feeds into sustaining other sectors, whether it's agriculture, industry, energy. So for example, just to illustrate that point, if we think about India, since independence, it was a big focus for successive governments on achieving food security and the green revolution, developing hybridized varieties of rice and wheat that could sustain the population. But that came at the cost of, a long history of state provision of free electricity for pumping groundwater and access to water for farmers that has resulted in very wasteful irrigation practices where water-intensive crops are being grown in areas which are not suited to them. So for example, whether it's growing sugarcane in Maharashtra or oranges or wheat or rice. And so I think, this idea of, particularly for agriculture, there are a lot of best practices around the world, whether it's countries like Israel or whether it's Australia, who have experienced the kind of, variabilities, whether it's drought or whether it's flooding, and have adapted their agricultural systems to adapt for that change. So if I think about agriculture, for example, there's a lot of experimentation happening, for example, even in parts of India, looking at conservation of zero tillage methods. So the Australian Centre for Integrated Agricultural Research, along with organizations in West Bengal, for example, are using zero till methods to try and conserve soil moisture and also reduce water losses to the system. Similarly, the government of Punjab, for example, is experimenting with a very unique scheme, which is looking at incentivizing farmers to use less electricity to pump groundwater and rewarding them, giving them cash incentives. So it's a kind of save water, save money scheme. So similarly, irrigation efficiency, using technology for smart cropping, drip irrigation, using drones, for example, these are all things that are possible. So the question becomes, how do you take these small pilots, these innovations to scale? And fundamentally coming back to that question of how do you build a culture of conservation and prepare for scarcity, or for that matter, even prepare for flooding or inundation in the future. Because I think, flooding is something, as Jessica said, we know it's going to happen. It's not always easy to plan for it. But even with flooding, there are a lot of experimentation going into India on flood-resistant varieties of wheat or rice or lentils and maize, etc. And also building, social safety mechanisms or buffers which provide protection to farmers in situations like that. When it comes to industry, again, we need to think carefully about where our industrial areas are located and what vulnerability those geographic areas have to flooding or inundation. I think related to that also, there's been so many, we have a lot of environmental laws, legislations, etc., but we've also seen a lot of flouting of those norms and rules. And so you have industries in areas that they really shouldn't be. And, going back to some of the questions we have, etc., of unplanned urbanization. And as Jessica pointed out, this idea of climate change significantly ups the financial risk for companies and industries. So we need to think about not only the stringent implementation of norms and infrastructures and policies, but also working with the industry, building best practices, and thinking about what are the investments in technology practices, incentives that we could give to industry to invest in not only climate proofing themselves, but also in whether it's the commodities they produce or the kind of inputs that they take from water, food, infrastructure, etc. Yeah, so I think this idea of how do you incentivize green behavior, whether it's at the farm level or it's at the industry level, is something that I think it's a kind of a combination of sort of behavioral change, which needs to happen at probably a more rapid pace than it's happening now. But I think there are a lot of good examples out there which we can learn from.
Thank you. Really fascinating. Terrific to hear that we've got good practice from places like Australia and Israel that are being shared with other areas. And I thought, for me, an interesting point there was this idea of saying to farmers, you shouldn't be taking water out of the ground, you shouldn't be pumping it, because you'd think that their priority would be to do that and governments would encourage them to do that. But in fact, what you're saying there is an example of people saying, actually, we shouldn't be incentivizing farmers to take this water from the aquifers. We've got quite a few questions coming in, and I want to make sure you have enough time to answer them. So I'm going to move on quickly to the last schedule, one of the last scheduled questions. And I'm going to give this to Alfred to answer, because I think this builds very much on what's just been mentioned. It's about governance and cooperation. And obviously water supply and flooding, these are cross-border issues. So I'd like to ask Alfred, how can governments improve water scarcity and flood risk governance and cooperation, whether it's at the national level or whether it's across borders?
Oh yes, John. Certainly governments are able to improve, the issues on the scarcities and the flood risk, governance at all times, because actually the government actually is holding or are holding the ultimate authorizations and a statutory the status to, well, in particular to negotiate that, and to implement and to actually establish that the respective laws and regulations at all levels. So whether if it actually release such the authorities that to water companies or to the others the operational bodies to run the water business, and they're still holding the ultimate the responsibilities and on the drinking the water supply issues at all times, and there's no doubt about that. But the only difference is how important and how actually and how much do they care about the placing the water in the government policies that at all times. And I must say I must confess that, and I think in most actually or in most situations, I think that the governments have not actually placed the water issues in the past decades at the very highest priorities in the past decades, perhaps not until actually in past well 10 or 15 years they start realizing that they can no longer actually taking it for granted because of the climate changes. So what we have to do now, or shall we say, we have started off, a little bit lagging behind, that in the situations, say for many governments, and I wouldn't dare to say, which governments are actually more responsible than the others, and because so, but now we're now facing it, that we're realizing, that, and now water scarcity and the risk, the first risk now actually is getting very, very, I would say that, critical nowadays. So for improving situations, we have actually, I would say that it's all down to, whether we have actually adopted, that, we have a risk-based approach to, to improve the situations. And in particular, that whether we can able to reduce, the water loss in water mains, and will actually reduce, the risk of the first risk, that. So actually, governments had actually engaged a lot of, say, consultancy studies, that we can do this, and I'm aware that that many governments that we have actually that friendly with, or even our own local governments here in Hong Kong now, which have actually used a risk-based approach to adopt for improving situations. We have a major a water loss that in the past well many years ago, but now we have actually aimed to improve our reduce or water main loss that. And say from 30% down to about 15% in is the past 10 years by actually by the rehabilitation programs, by replacing all the old mains in 10 years time, which we were glad to say that we have actually able to to achieve that now. That's one thing. And also we have actually used a lot of the risk in the more modeling system and to predict our climate change that in the past few in the forthcoming weather situations, in order to realize that how much rainfall we are going to anticipate it. So we actually would able to actually to fully utilize our actually rainwater harvesting in facilities at all times. So another thing is that we should adopt the more if resources available. We should able to adopt more an up-to-date technology like what we say an intelligent network by installing sensing and monitoring equipment in our network system. So in order to to monitor the water pressure and the water mains distributions at all times, so we can able to penalize any water lost within our network system in the city areas. And
yeah. So that's
one thing we're doing now.
Thank you, Alfred. Some very good ideas there. A thought that occurs to me, and perhaps we'll come back to it in a moment, is this risk-based approach is extremely important and can be very effective. The question then, of course, is whose risk is it? Because if you're one country that borders another and you choose to dam a river, the risk is all your neighbours rather than yours. So
That's a quick thing I need to add on is, say, we have actually made, a cross-border, arrangement and agreement, say with mainland or like Singapore with the Malaysian government to secure our, the fresh water supplies, for at least, that last for about 5 to 10 years to secure the fresh water supplies at all times.
I think that's a great example. So I want to move on to the last question, which is, it's really about what is the role of professionals in contributing to these issues, which it could relate to data, it could relate to risk management, as we just discussed, standards, or project delivery. But I want to sort of, in answering that question, I just want to pick up on some of the questions that we've had coming through. So let me just pick a few here. There's what is the role of institutions in dealing with systemic water risks? So can we have some thoughts on that from the panel? Also, let me find another one. How do large global conurbations such as Osaka and Alexandria, Rio de Janeiro, these are built on plateaus or in valleys. How do they protect themselves against the challenges of unmanageable water volumes? Could we say something a little bit more about the case of what's happening in Mumbai, the solutions that might be applicable there? And also perhaps a question on, could we elaborate on what tools water companies have at their disposal to manage supply and customer expectations? So there's a whole row of questions there. So water companies and supply and expectations, the role of institutions, and the particular challenges of certain areas, Mumbai, and areas that perhaps aren't too dissimilar in their geography, at least, Osaka and Alexandria. So I'm going to give the floor first to Jessica. Perhaps you can try and tackle some of those questions for us.
Okay, so I think, yeah, so going back to the report that you referred to before, where we did an international comparison, we asked surveyors and built environment professionals in China, in America, in Germany, in Australia, and the UK about their views about how built environment professionals could contribute, but specifically around flooding. And the number of areas that they came up with was quite striking. So, I mean, everybody recognises that as built environment professionals, we have due diligence and we need to be making sure that we're giving good advice to our clients and customers. And that could cover valuation and investment. So trying to build in future thinking into valuations, but also protecting people's investments against risk, thinking about facility and site management and giving good advice on how that can be, how you can use your site, and that could apply equally to water management, scarcity and inundation. Thinking about reinstatement and recovery after disasters, and that's a really key area where the built environment profession is going to be brought in. We're giving, as built environment professionals are being brought in at regular intervals in the life cycle of a building or built space. One of them is there after a disaster during reinstatement, giving advice on adaptation. Going beyond that and thinking about risk transfer, so in terms of the built environment, where is the insurance? Where is the compensation for the monetary losses that are being experienced? And also thinking about new development. And I think we focused quite a lot of that a lot on that in this webinar, thinking about building and rapid urbanisation, and that aspects of advising on better construction and new development that might be resilient in the future. So there's so many roles that a built environment professional may have. But what they also said to us was that regulation and professional competencies and professional indemnity was sometimes getting in the way of that. So I think, to come back to the question about institutions and governance, it is built environment professionals are keen to get involved. Institutions, as their representatives and governance bodies, can help built environments getting involved by, first of all, coming up with codes of practice, guidelines within professions, but also lobbying governments and working across professions. I just wanted to give an example of that in flood risk in the UK. So currently we have an adaptation plan for property flood resilience, and at the table, this has been set up by industry and government, and at the table there are representatives from the insurance industry, built environment, from CIWEM, from the Institute of Civils, from the RICS, and all of the institutions have been collaborating to try and move the agenda and the debate forward. And one of the outputs of that has been a code of practice, which has just been launched in February, which has been signed up to by all of the institutions to try and create a better market and a better delivery of property flood resilience for people in the UK. So I think institutions have a massive role to play in this and in supporting the professionals who are keen and ready and able to help develop urban areas.
So some very, very practical things there. Mandakini, can I ask you to comment particularly on the challenges that somewhere like Mumbai might face? And just to throw in another thought from our questions online, one of our attendees is asking about, can we make better use of technology and infrastructure for storing of water? So what are the options, I think, available for somewhere like Mumbai?
I mean, I think, Mumbai and is in a very unique situation and not an enviable one necessarily. It's it's India's commercial hub. It has a large concentration, a very concentrated population in a very small space, and because it's an island and because it's also located on a floodplain, I mean, and because it is subject to storm surges and other because it's coastal, I think it has a gamut of challenges that it's dealing with. And I think because of climate change and the kind of intense precipitation we've seen in Mumbai, I mean, weeks worth of rainfall in a couple of days or sometimes even in a couple of hours, I think the challenge for water managers or sort of city planners is immense because of the kind of disruption you've seen to daily life, people not being able to leave their homes for days sometimes because water levels were so high. I mean, I think one way to think about it, and which is not to say that there is, these are things which are, being planned, are being discussed and being done on the ground, is to look at kind of, because of the high concentration of population. I mean, Mumbai is has one of the largest concentrations of high rises, I think, in Delhi. It's very difficult to imagine being able to suddenly, start from scratch and raise everything to the ground and build anew. So I think it's working with your built environment and in a natural environment in a way that is complementary. I mean, if I think about Delhi, for example, where air pollution is such a big problem, and people talk about rebuilding the lungs of Delhi, which means its forests, its green spaces. I think similarly, what people are talking about are rebuilding Mumbai's, rebuilding the sponge for Mumbai. So whether it's wetlands, it's mangroves, basically it's natural infrastructure, it's green infrastructure that absorbs this excess water when it comes in, not only seasonally with the monsoons, but also, periodically. I think a lot of the city planning happens just before, the deluge. And I think that's a kind of management, also thinking and practice, which has to change. So, along with building, for example, looking at how do you rehabilitate some of Mumbai's, natural wetlands, mangroves, etc., its own rivers, the role of creeks, for example. How do you improve existing storm drainage systems and infrastructure to prevent storm surges? How do you supplement and improve urban drainage, and at the same time work towards preventing, or to the extent possible, kind of easing the kind of pressure on land in terms of encroachments, etc. And I think it's a question of working with rather against. And to kind of segue that into your question around can we use technology and infrastructure solutions, I think for a long time, in India for certain, and in many parts of the world, for example, there's a sense of, there's a fetish for infrastructure and building storage and building dams and building other hard infrastructure. And in many instances, particularly when it comes to, climate risk and uncertainty, or whether it's on rivers or it's on other spaces, those infrastructures can actually create more problems than sustain them. So I think certainly if you're talking about infrastructure in terms of small scale investments in household level or community or neighborhood level rainwater harvesting or at industry scale, sure. But I think there is a lot that is being done and is being talked about, even in terms of issues around rehabilitating some of this aging infrastructure, dams, etc., and what can be done to make them more resilient, but also working with, I think, more innovative ways in terms of trying to, water needs to flow, so you can't really stop it from flowing. So the question is, what can you do to make it flow in a way that is least disruptive, least, in terms of destabilizing for social, economic life to continue, and also how can you store it in a way that's useful and can be, sorts of, I suppose, buffer force in the future.
Thank you, Mandaka. And while you have the microphone, perhaps I can just throw another question at you, which comes from Jyotiraj Patra, who's asking about illegal water markets in many of our cities. And I think the reference is to Indian cities. Is there a quick comment on what we could do about these, shall we call them informal water networks?
I mean, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a factor. It's a fact of life in India, and for many cities where you have large urban centers where water is essentially being tanked in or trucked in from rural areas, very often, extraction from groundwater resources elsewhere. And it's called, so for example, in Chennai, when it made headlines last year, a lot of the critique was also about the so-called tanker mafia and how that exists. Now, how do you go about addressing those entrenched interests? I think, we all appreciate that water is deeply political, and we're increasingly seeing its politicization when you have issues of scarcity and flooding. I think one way to address the issue is definitely to try and find ways to improve access, and making sure that access is, to the extent possible, as equitably and socially and economically distributed in a just way. And so it requires, again, it requires a holistic approach, which on the one hand will look at reforming or repairing, broken piped infrastructure, trying and making it accessible to more people, but also obviously cracking down on illegal practices where they exist. And again, going back,
I think we lost you there, Mandakini, but we're running out of time anyway. So I'm just going to ask Alfred, Alfred, very, very briefly, because you're involved in a number of professions. So can I ask you to just say very briefly, if there's one thing that would bring the professions together and have them collaborate more effectively, from your experience, what's the one thing they could do better on collaboration?
Oh, the one thing could actually get it together, perhaps just like Jessica mentioned about, is I would say that a mutual recognition, between all bodies, right? We certainly will link us up more together, more frequent. I will take examples like that Jessica mentioned about us, a SciWem. We and the SciWem has actually established a mutual recognition system. With the, I'm not too sure if you're aware of the IWA, the International Water Association, which is the largest association, somewhat equivalent to the WHO, but on the water issues internationally. We have actually establish our linkage, between the two bodies, from individual professional levels to the organizational, the establishment levels. These will put up people on the same area and the same aspects together. and to work it out more closely. So this would be the one thing which actually we would share.
That's a very clear single thought, and our time is up, so I'm going to have to close it there. We could talk about this issue all day long, but that is all we have time for today. So many thanks to our international panel. Firstly, Dr. Jessica Lamond, Professor in Real Estate and Climate Risk at the University of the West of England, Mandakini Suri, International Development Consultant in Water, Energy, Food, Gender and Climate Change, based in South Asia. And also, last but by no means least, Alfred Lee, Past President Hong Kong of the Chartered Institution of Water and Environmental Management. If you're listening today, do please let us know what you thought of the webinar by completing the online poll, which will appear on your screen in just a moment. And thanks once again to Colliers International, World Built Environment Forum Premier Partner, and to our executive partners, Glodon and Shanghai Oriental Investment Supervision Company. You can also find us on Twitter, on LinkedIn, and on Instagram. So please do go to any of those channels and search for World Built Environment Forum, and you will find us there. That is all we've got time for today. Thank you very much, and please do join us again. We've got plenty more webinars in the pipeline, so just keep an eye on the website for those. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Jessica and Nicodemus.
Thank you very much, John, and everybody for joining.